Hello, my name's David Sanderson from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and this is a recording of a lecture I gave recently at the City Futures Research Centre based in UNSW, where I work. And the lecture is called Not So Natural Disasters, How Corruption Fuels Catastrophe. And I want to unpack over the next few minutes the misconception that disasters are natural. They're absolutely not natural, and that we do an awful lot to fuel them in the decisions we make in society. The talk comes just a few short weeks after the absolutely devastating earthquakes that took place in Turkey and Syria that have been in the news. Over 50,000 are now dead. When I gave this lecture the other week, it was 47. The earthquakes are very big and not only struck Turkey, but of course parts of Syria where a terrible civil war has been raging for several years. And the numbers speak for themselves at how awful that was. Tragically, the scale of loss is nothing new, however, and a few from recent years. Just last November, the Indonesia earthquake killed over 330 people and injured over 2,000. Lots of schools were damaged, and I want to come back to that later, and over 100 children died of the full death toll. We may recall the Haiti earthquake from 2010, which was particularly devastating, killing well over 220,000 people. It may well have been actually rather more. No one really knows, with an awful lot of people injured. And that struck in January 2010. And the Sichuan earthquake in May 2008 in China, there was a very big earthquake. Nearly 90,000 people were killed, and over 5,300 were killed. Quote from Britannica, the bulk of them students attending classes. The theme I'm unpacking here is schools that fall down that maybe shouldn't have. And then many other tragic events, the earthquake in Pakistan and northern India from 2005 that killed upwards of 80,000 people, or over that I should say. The Gujarat earthquake in Western India, the Nepal earthquakes in 2015. There have been many, not least also the 1999 earthquake that struck Turkey, going back to Turkey, that killed over 17,000 people. And at that time, it was August, it was 1999, there were earthquakes, and there were builders being chased down the street because of buildings that fell down that should not have fallen down. And in part, that tragedy led to a change in government and assurances that such terrible disasters would try to be mitigated in the future. These are some of the earthquakes with the highest death tolls over the last century. In fact, longer than that. What's that? Yes, well, the last century, more or less, just over that. And numbers just aren't everything, of course, to do with disasters. But this is something of the point I'm trying to make, that there's nothing new here. And we call these natural disasters. You hear that all the time. They're not. A colleague who's a very senior advisor in India, when he goes to a disaster, he says, this isn't a natural disaster, this is a crime scene. This is a crime scene, a very powerful statement. And I want to use the rest of this time to unpack what may have been meant by that phrase, that this actually is a crime scene. So the first thing to say, I want to just share two models with you from disaster management. The first is that disasters aren't natural. They take two conditions. One is the hazard, the natural event itself, the earthquake or the tsunami or the whatever it might be, or the heavy rainstorm, or the volcano going off. But on the other side, you need vulnerability. You need, sadly, to be vulnerable for a hazard to turn into a disaster. Now, there are lots of ways to write this. We can divide by exposure and all kinds of things, and there are nuances about how disaster is defined, but it's pretty much a hazard meeting a vulnerable condition. So what I want to talk about now is not the hazard on the right, vital as that is, obviously, but on the left, vulnerability. And the second model I want to share with you is what's called the pressure and release model. And it's a simple, meaning good, way of unpacking vulnerability into three elements. The unsafe conditions, so working back from the disaster there. The unsafe conditions. What caused the unsafe conditions? That would be the dynamic pressures. What caused the dynamic pressures? That would be the root causes. Now, instantly, of course, it's extremely complicated, and that's one of the realities of life. I want to focus on two or three issues and talk from there, but I want to start with the unsafe conditions. And the unsafe conditions we're talking about right now relate to buildings falling down in earthquakes. And as the very tragic saying goes, It's not the earthquake that kills you, it's the building that kills you. It's the building collapse that killed you. And just to look at some of the earthquakes I just mentioned in setting this up, in Sichuan, an unequal disaster. This is a BBC report. Why is it that around this area it's only the classroom buildings that collapsed? China has fairly rigorous building codes. The problem is implementation. Oh, I'm so sorry. The image seems to have. What that says is you can buy the building inspector, you can't buy off the earthquake, from a seismologist at the time being quoted. And the photograph, not mine, it's from the BBC, is a party official asking forgiveness to parents whose children were in the schools. I mentioned the Indonesia earthquake from last November. Almost 53,000 schools in earthquake-prone regions, about 60 million students at risk. And there's a very stark comment here from a quote from a professor of engineering at the University of Indonesia. Contractors choose economic profit over safety, on record for saying that. And there's a reason why I'm actually quoting an awful lot of journalistic pieces, which I'll come back to later, as opposed to research, of which there's some but not much. And let me return to that. This one image, and I should have shown that, again, from the BBC. I've gone back a slide here. That's the building on the left, built, I think it was 2019. That's the building now on the right, the same building. This is built 4 years ago, less than 4 years ago. Look what's happened. There were children in there and parents and people getting on with their lives. This is not a poverty issue. This is a failure to adhere to the building codes issue. So let me jump now, going back to the progression of vulnerability from The Economist. And The Economist headline for that article, Turkey's earthquakes show the deadly extent of construction scams. And they and the BBC report on this, and others, and The Guardian extensively. More than 50% of buildings, something like 13 million buildings built illegally. Government construction amnesties for structures built within the required safety certificates, without the required safety certificates, going back to the 60s. And I think it was 2018, the last time the amnesties were put in place. That means if you build a building and you don't comply, you can apply for an amnesty, you pay money, and then your building is given an amnesty. And as we pointed out, to reuse the phrase, earthquakes don't get amnesties, but buildings that fall down and kill people do. And something like up to 75,000 buildings across the earthquake zone have earthquake amnesties. It's beyond belief. And let me just, in fact, go back to, I skated over ability. Why is that? The dynamic pressure, and I'm putting forward that it's corruption. There are lots of reasons for these things, but a big glaring open one is corruption. Okay, what caused the buildings to fall down? It is a matter of record that corruption is a leading cause. And let me unpack that. Let me show this image here from Dhaka in Bangladesh. And the boy's just going down into the camera. I'm taking it. And the reason I'm showing that image there is the very big building in the background is as illegal as are the people who are living along the railway track in the foreground. And that was a well-known building in Dhaka in Bangladesh that was subsequently demolished. It was built through corrupt practice. And the definition I'm using here from Transparency International, the NGO, is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And the World Bank's definition is somewhat similar to that, and transparency is that. Now, corruption is to be found in every single country on the planet. This is not a North Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, post-colonial, whatever it might be. Probably the best evidence we have, and I know this is contested, relates to Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. It's quite hard to measure corruption. Not many people will fill in a questionnaire saying, how corrupt are you? So this is the perception of corruption of public sector, okay? And it's drawn from lots of different surveys. Please look up the research method. And basically, the darker the red the color, the greater the perception of corruption of that country. And clearly this is broad brush. We're generalizing whole countries. But do take a look at it. It's a powerful piece of work. The point I want to make is all countries suffer corruption. And I'm recording this right now in Sydney, Australia, and I'm proudly Australian and British. And yet in the last 10 years, Australia has dropped in the perception of corruption index by a number of places. How does this link to earthquakes? Well, there's not a lot of research, but one of the best known that we have relates to the work of Roger Billam and Nick Ambrosese. who in 2011, on the first anniversary of the Haiti earthquake, looked at the correlations between corruption in countries and where fatalities are worst from earthquakes. And they said that over 4/5, 83% of all deaths from building collapse the last 30 years occurred in more corrupt countries. They use the word anomalous. I'm just doing a shorthand. Please look this up. It's freely available. Nature Journal is a leading global journal. I just want to show one piece of work from their outstanding piece of research here. This obviously is a three-dimensional representation. The back left is where you don't want to be, where fatalities are high, where it's thought to be worse, your expectation of quality of life, and you're more corrupt. And you can see, tragically, Haiti is there. It says USSR, Russia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, China, India, Mexico, Italy, Greece, where there have been terrible earthquakes. And then on the other side, still awful, obviously, the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand, in Chile, that killed, I think, some 600 people, something like that. And of course, disasters in the USA. So, but what you do see is a marked difference. How do we know this? Well, the work at Ambrosius and Billam, and a few of us just last year tried to do something of a more, well, not more in depth. That's an injustice to Ambrosius and Billam, but we did quite a large review of literature, and this is peer-reviewed literature, academic literature, so-called, around what do we know about how corruption fuels disasters? What's the link? And we found 59 papers in the end from quite a big trawl, and these are colleagues from a number of universities and NGOs, and we published this in Disasters Journal. But we did find there's not a lot, and I'm coming back to the point I made earlier that a lot of what we do know is thanks to investigative journalism. And there is some research, of course there is, but not a lot compared to the scale of the issue. And there are reasons for that, perhaps. It's cross-disciplinary, it's incredibly complicated, it's hard. For investigative journalists, there's a risk, and all manner of things. One of the people who's been writing a lot about this for many years is Professor George Ofori, who's at London South Bank University, and we asked George to give a talk 3 years ago at UNSW, which George very kindly did online at the time of COVID, about crises, construction and corruption. And George is linked to an NGO called COST, and they look at corruption and construction. And sorry to say that there's a lot to look at. And I just do want to make the point, this is a global issue. Where I am now in Australia, there have been 3 inquiries, 3 royal commissions looking at corruption in construction, because it's the buildings that collapse at times of disasters that tragically kill you. And not always in times of disaster, of course, at other times too. When COVID came out, this small piece on the right, written by Martin Loosemore and myself, we were attending an OECD meeting online, Organised of Economic Cooperation and Development, an OECD meeting. And somebody asked the head of transparency, I think it was in OECD, how is COVID playing out? And his quote was, "A paradise for corruption." And we've sadly seen that play out, how when times are tight and procurement is put on a back burner or simplified, with the excuse of expediency is needed, then corruption seeps in. And very sadly, there are inquiries into that. But we're talking about earthquakes today, and I just want to go back to the third part of the progression of vulnerability. And this is a gigantic subject, and I'm shamefaced for any political economists who may be watching this, or others almost all know a lot more about governance than I do. Governance is unsurprisingly the issue, and a definition for governance that's held for over 400 years is the method of management, as simple and as complicated as that. And there's a lot to be said, obviously, around governance. And I'm just giving generalizations here. About good governance, many would argue it's about accountability, transparency, responsiveness, being equitable and inclusive, effective and efficient, participatory, transparency in government, a vibrant media outlet that can speak truth to power. When you have less of that, when media is shut down and newspapers are shut down, and we can all think of examples currently to do with that, then you get risks that you get societies becoming more closed, more perverse decisions being made. I'm just speaking now where the proposal by the government in Georgia to make more, what's the thing, about government, about NGOs. I didn't prep this very well, as you can see, about NGOs claim themselves to be funded more than 20% by foreign sources. That law has been put down now, and that proposal put back because of mass demonstrations from civil society in Georgia. My point is here that there's good and there's bad governance, and this is an immensely complicated area. But I do want to make the point, coming back to Haiti, in fact, that when we talk about Haiti, we're talking about centuries of problems. And this quote from 2023, that shouldn't disappear, the Brookings Institute, and I'll just read that. Nearly half the country's population face acute hunger. The country struggles with cholera, high prices and shortages of food. And I took that photo just 7 or 8 years ago. That's a typical street scene in Port-au-Prince. That's not an unusual street scene. And then we could go back and look at colonial reparations and elites capture from a small number of families who basically run the country. And that quote says, and that was straight after the earthquake, nothing exposes the vulnerability of countries, of the vulnerability of people living in poverty more than disasters such as earthquakes, like a torch that comes in and shines a tragic light on the vulnerability of societies and poverty. That was a fellow from the UN the day after the earthquake. Now, this next one is, I'm putting it up there because it's pointing out how nefarious, how complicated, how the tentacles of corruption go through. This is the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum has been doing a lot of research on corruption and these sort of interactive sort of maps, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, you can look up online. The quote here from some years ago, the cost of corruption is very high, and no one really knows. The World Bank's done quite a lot of work on this. But immediately it's complicated and difficult and hard. And a few of us have been trying to, we just sort of starting point. If you take the starting point, a little bit of the pressure release model, really. If you take the disaster, why did it happen? Is it people living in the wrong place? Is it the amounts of poverty? Is it disaster preparedness that should be there that it's not? Is it building an infrastructure that's in the wrong place at the wrong time? Is it resilience that could have been there? Then immediately, and the list on the left is a taxonomy of corruption problems. I'm pretty sure it's from the European Union, on that from a number of years ago. And it could be anybody's list about nepotism and dispersals of money and corruption and cronyism and bribery. And these are very hard and difficult things to look at. We were just at the starting point about some of these things relating to construction. Of course, there's a lot on anti-corruption measures, and I just want to end by saying that. I had rather more slides on this, but I took them out. If you do a Google search for corruption, anti-corruption, you'll find a lot. I've mentioned costs before, big regular meetings from the OECD and others, Integrity Action, Transparency International, and I'm sorry to say my little video screen here is covering up the logo for iPaidAbribe.com, the Indian Transparency Initiative. And there's a lot that's on in this place, but clearly not enough, because the message here is that disasters aren't natural, earthquakes aren't natural, and we keep seeing the same patterns with rapid urbanization, rapid urban growth, the number of people being born into society now, the overwhelming majority of which are being born in cities. City growth is phenomenal and continuing. We're more at risk, and we need to take this more seriously, if you like. There are lots of measures, but there needs to be more at it, and transparency is a big issue. And campaigns, I just finished with this one, campaigns such as disasters are not natural, and you can look that up. But thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope it was of some help.